Richard and I love to get together, and he loves to hear my record collecting and tracking down stories. I was a record executive for years. I'm an author. I'm a music historian. I'm a collector, but the thing I love most is buying and selling rare stuff, and that's my business. And 3 years ago, I had one of the great experiences of my life in tracking stuff down. I found 149 Bob Dylan acetates that had belonged to Bob Dylan and that he used in making 3 albums, Nashville Skyline, Self-Portrait, and New Morning. For those of you who don't know, this is what an acetate is. In fact, this is one of Bob Dylan's acetates of New Morning. And it's a one-of-a-kind record cut on lacquer-coated aluminum after a recording session, so an artist or a manager or a record company can take it home, listen to it, and decide if they want to change anything. So this whole adventure starts when I get a call from a friend of mine who's a curator at the Seattle Music Museum, the Experience Music Project. And he's just had a meeting with a guy whose sister has died. This guy's a Seattle resident. The museum's in Seattle, but the guy's sister lives in New York. And her main asset is a 7-story building on West Houston Street in Manhattan that she had bought for $80,000 in 1968. She died, and they were going to put it on the market for $23 million. She was a starving artist, but had the prescience to buy this building. And her brother had to clear the building out, sell all of her and her late husband's books and art and furniture, and on his 4th and final pass through, clearing this house out so they could put it on the market so somebody could come and trash it and could turn it into a new Gap store or something. This guy noticed a little cabinet he hadn't seen and opened it up, and there were 2 boxes that said old records. And he went in there and found 150 of these. And he knew they were some kind of record, but he didn't know what they were. They didn't have printed covers. Some of them had writing on paper covers. They had handwritten labels. Most of them said Bob Dylan. And he knew Bob Dylan had rented the ground floor of this building in 1969 for about 3 years to have a studio in it from his sister. And he theorized when Bob Dylan moved out, he probably left these things, and his sister, being a pack rat, probably just threw them in a box, threw them in this closet 40 plus years before. And so the guy had to go back to Seattle where he lived, and he took a couple of these and was Googling and couldn't figure out what they were, so he called the local music museum and made an appointment. And that's how he found his way to my friend Jason. And Jason told him that these were acetates, what they were, and that they were valuable, and tried to get this guy to donate them to the museum. And the guy said, no, I'm the executor. I have a financial obligation to try and monetize these things, so I can't donate them. Do you have any other ideas? And he said, yeah, I'm going to put my friend Jeff Gold in touch with you. He's kind of a Bob Dylan specialist and a market maker in this stuff, and he'll be all over this. So he put me in touch with this guy on the phone. And the guy was very friendly, and I said, do you know how many of these you have? No, they're all in New York. Do you know that they're all Bob Dylan? No, I think so. Do you know what any of the titles are? No. Do you know what kind of condition they're in? No. I just need to get somebody to come to New York to buy all these things and get them out of here because I've got to put this place on the market. And I know they're fragile. I don't want to be schlepping them around. And I said, okay, well, look, without knowing any of these things, I'm going to give you a ballpark guess for the bare minimum of what I can pay you for these. And acetates are very valuable to collectors if they're a collectible act. And Bob Dylan's a very collectible act. And these are thousands of dollars a piece. But not knowing the condition or anything, I quoted him a big number. And he said, okay, that sounds fine. And I flew to New York in about 4 days. And you never know what you're going to find on these missions. And I was really surprised when I went to the apartment that his sister had lived in for the last year of her life. And I opened these boxes, and everything was perfect. They were clean and beautifully arranged. Everything was in great condition, and a lot of them had writing on them like this one does. And knowing a lot about Bob Dylan's handwriting, another subtopic I've gone into, I knew a lot of them had Bob Dylan's handwriting on them. So I was very excited. I couldn't listen to them. I didn't know what was on them, but this looked very promising. And a couple of sheets of paper came out between some of them that had Bob Dylan sequencing his album New Morning and trying out different sequences. And I was getting very excited. And after about an hour, I said to this guy, look, I'm going to pay you 3.5 times that number I quoted you. And he literally jumped up and high-fived me and was, screaming. He was so happy. And this was many tens of thousands of dollars. So he was thrilled. And we walked about 4 blocks to the nearest branch of my bank, and I got him a really large cashier's check, and he was thrilled. And I took these back to Los Angeles, and the kind of tension for a record collector of having all these things and not being able to play them and not knowing whether they're released or unreleased, what they are, was huge. And so my assistant and I started methodically transferring these things, and it became apparent almost immediately there was lots of different versions of things, different takes. And as we really stared at these things, I realized what they were. They were a conversation between Bob Dylan and his producer, Bob Johnson. And Bob Dylan was in New York, and Bob Johnson was headquartered at CBS in Nashville. And they did some of the recording in Nashville and some of the recording in New York, and Bob Johnson would take the tapes back to Nashville and do overdubs and mix them and send acetates to Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan would call him up on the phone. He'd make little notes on the sleeves. This one is Bob Johnson's writing, but it says, Ron, guitar up on ending, Bromberg up on beginning. So mix notes, he'd call Bob Johnson, tell him what to do. Bob Johnson would do those changes, cut another acetate, send it to Bob Dylan. So these were their conversation about how to put these records together in different sequences and different changes. And Bob Dylan is a famous guy for not caring about the ephemera from his career, and I'm sure what happened is these were tools to finish these records, and once the records were finished, he didn't care about these anymore and left them when he moved out of the place, and this guy's sister had saved them. So I knew this was a really important historic thing for the very small community of obsessed Bob Dylan people like myself. And I didn't want people driving me crazy about what was what until I had all our ducks in a row. So we transferred everything, we photographed everything, we cataloged everything. There were 3 really big wins. There were, other than all the unreleased versions and takes and mixes, there were totally unknown electric versions of Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire and Folsom Prison Blues, and a totally unknown gospel version of Tomorrow Is Such a Long Time, just fantastic stuff. And then I called my friend who manages Bob Dylan, because I felt like I had to tell him that this was I discovered these. And I had called a lawyer in New York and said, what's the legal position? He said, well, look, if this guy moved out of an apartment or a studio 45 years ago and left these there, they're abandoned property by any measure. You'd get laughed out of court. So I called my friend who's Bob Dylan's manager, and I said, look, I found these. I'm going to make transfers of everything. We're going to give you transfers of everything. And even though they're legally mine, I'll be happy to cut you in on what I get from the ones I'm going to sell. I'm going to keep some of them. And he said, no, don't worry. You've been great to us. Go and be good. So I've breathed a big sigh of relief. And then the story got really weird. I have a blog. I have a rare record website in music memorabilia, and I have a blog that gets read by about 250 people a day where I write about obscure things for record collectors. And so I wrote this long blog post telling this whole story with some pictures of some of the acetates. And I posted on my blog, and I woke up the next morning, and instead of 250 hits, I had 12,500. Wow. Jesus Christ, nothing like that's ever happened. And then about 20 minutes later, I get a call from somebody congratulating me on the Rolling Stone article. Rolling Stone article? And he goes, go on to rollingstone.com. I go on to rollingstone.com, and the lead article is, collector discovers 149 Bob Dylan acetates in New York building. And they have literally taken my blog and rewritten the whole thing except for about 2 paragraphs. And those 2 paragraphs, they've quoted me and said, Gold commented. And all that was just not the 2 portions. They didn't rewrite my blog. And they took the pictures. And I know the people from Rolling Stone. They interview me with some frequency, but nobody had called me. About half an hour later, I get a call from the Wall Street Journal. Listen, we want to do an interview about these Bob Dylan acetates. Oh, okay. I do an interview with that guy, and in the frenzy of 21st century communications, everybody wants to be the first person, so they don't bother to check anything out. This guy actually did. He wrote an article. And Jody, my wife, and I are kind of I'm going to Google this and see where else this shows up. And over the next 3 days, there were 100 articles in newspapers as prominent as the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer. I was getting calls from like Spanish and French television stations wanting to come over and interview me. It was absolutely insane. And I did 3 interviews out of those 100 articles. Everybody else was just rewriting my blog or rewriting an article where somebody had rewritten my blog. And at this point, I'm thinking, I better call Bob Dylan's manager and let him know I'm not stirring all this stuff up. And I did, and he said, I really appreciate that. You know, Bob's not into the internet, but even he heard about this and called me. And he said, but I told him, you know, you'd told us about it and given us transfers and offered to cut us in. And I said, and I still will, no need, don't worry about it. And it was just this insane thing that went on for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it finally died down. And at the end of it all, I thought, you know, the most fucked up thing about all this is I could have made this whole thing up. Nobody had seen these things. Nobody had heard these things. This was all based on a few pictures that I could have photoshopped in my podunk blog. Luckily for all those media outlets, and luckily for me, I didn't.